World War II in American life is often called the Good War. Now, this is very strange because World War II was the most disastrous, the most destructive, the most lethal war in the history of the human race. Somewhere between 40 and 60 million people died in World War II. And Americans call it the Good War. What in the world could they be thinking? What does this say about World War II that Americans call it the Good War? What does it say about Americans that Americans call it the Good War? To answer these questions, we have to look a little bit into American history, and particularly the history of America's wars. So, Americans went into World War II with personal memories in some cases and historical memories of war. What war was, what it was supposed to be, what one might expect to come out of wars. And it's a kind of checkered history. It's a kind of clouded memory that Americans had. So if you go through America's wars, to list the big ones, the serious wars, there's the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, which started in 1812, the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, the Civil War of the 1860s, the Spanish-American War of 1898, World War I, which for the United States lasted from 1917 to 1918, World War II, and then if we go beyond World War II, we have the Korean War, the early 1950s, the Vietnam War of the 1960s and 1970s, the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War of 1991, and then wars against Afghanistan and Iraq, starting in the early 21st century. So those are the wars. And of those wars, it's World War II that stands out as the Good War. Now, one thing I want to say about this is that unlike all the other wars, World War II has never seriously been criticized. America's participation in World War II, the whole idea of World War II, has never been seriously criticized. And this cannot be said of any of the other of America's wars. Now, historians, people who write about history for a living, they have an incentive to try to engage in what's sometimes called revisionist history, revise accepted wisdom. One can understand that wars rally patriotic fervor, and during a war, maybe it's not considered good form or good taste to criticize the war effort. After all, during a war, we need to all pull together. But of course, once the war is over, then why not? Because, as I say, historians have an incentive to challenge the premises of war because that gives them an excuse to write new books. And otherwise, if you can't come up with new ideas, new opinions about old things, then historians would have a whole lot less to write about. Anyway, so historians have challenged American participation, American motives and incentives in every war but World War II. There has never been a sustained critique of World War II. And I'll talk about the critiques of other wars, some of which actually began while the war was on. The American Revolutionary War, this is one that seems like one that everyone should celebrate because Americans rise up, fight for their independence, fight for their freedom from Britain, and after a long slog, they win. The United States is this new country, and it goes on to great things. So what is not to like? Well, the thing is that the concept, the basic idea of Americans against the British in the Revolutionary War is fundamentally wrong. There was a lot more to it than that. In fact, the struggle, the most bitter part of the struggle, the part that was the hardest to get over, was the struggle among the Americans. Because, from the distance of hindsight, of the future, we can say that it was Americans against the British. But before it was Americans against the British, and actually even during the while that it was Americans against British, it was also Americans against Americans. There's a good argument for calling the Revolutionary War America's first civil war because We remember the Patriot heroes. We remember the George Washingtons and the Benjamin Franklins and the James Madisons and the Alexander Hamiltons. But there were important people, intelligent people, distinguished people who opposed the idea of independence. John Adams, another independence hero, conceded that at the beginning of the struggle, the patriots, the ones who wanted independence, and the loyalists, the ones who opposed independence, were just about equally balanced. They each had about a third of the population, and there was a third in the middle that either hadn't made up its mind or just wanted to be left alone. So America's war was a division of American opinion, a division of American views from the very beginning. There was another problem with the Revolutionary War. I mentioned it was a long slog. Yeah, it was a long slog. Wars are tough to sustain. It's really hard to maintain enthusiasm for war when they go on for year after year after year. The model of a war, for most people, at least most people who fight the wars, is let's make it short. Let's go to war, let's get it over with and be done. So the Revolutionary War has a couple of strikes against it in the good war column. As I say, those aren't the things you learn in your elementary school history class. You just will learn the high points, the good stuff. But once you start digging in, you'll realize that the Revolutionary War was more complicated than it seems, by the way. And this is a basic lesson of history. The more you dig into anything, the more complicated the issues are. If you really don't like complications, then you're probably not going to be very happy with the serious study of history. That's just an aside. The War of 1812, America's second war, again pits the United States against Britain. This was a war that was almost as divisive in its beginning as the Revolutionary War. The advocates of war were called the war hawks, and the opponents of war, I don't know if they were called doves at that point. That would happen much later. That's sort of the opposite of hawks. But the opponents of war thought that this was just a cooked up job of Southerners and Westerners who were eager, who were aggressive, who wanted to get their hands on Canada, who wanted to get their hands on more land for expansion into Florida. And it really didn't have anything to do with the interests of the country as a whole. If it did, the argument was that, okay, the British are seizing American merchant vessels and they're kidnapping American sailors. Interestingly, significantly, the part of the country that was most injured by these seizures was New England. And it was the part of the country that didn't want a war. The New Englanders, the merchants of New England, the ship owners of New England, the sailors of New England, they wanted the business that they had developed with Britain. And a war would certainly destroy the business. So no sooner had the war been launched, it was declared by Congress, and this is the way wars are supposed to be declared in America's constitutional system. And the New Englanders started to say, this isn't for us. In fact, it got so far that some New Englanders, led by Daniel Webster, who would become one of the great advocates of the Union, made the case that New England might just secede from the rest of the country because its interests, its regional interest, had been ignored. And the opposition of New England had been rolled over by the other sections of the country. And when the war went badly for the United States, the New Englanders and Webster said, we told you so. And it was only a last-minute victory by Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans that sort of saved the War of 1812 in American opinion, because before then, it had been a disaster. In fact, the advocates of war, the war hawks, had said, it's just going to take a couple of companies of Kentucky riflemen and we'll march right through Canada and add Canada to the United States. Boy, that would be great, double the size of the United States. In fact, in those days, it would have more than double the size of the United States. But that's not the way it happened. America's attempts to invade, take over Canada were repelled. And in fact, on the ground, the military developments of the War of 1812 are all in Britain's favor. It got so bad that the British invaded and occupied Washington, the American capital. Imagine that. If you can take the capital of the enemy, then you're really giving that enemy a thrashing. They burned the White House, they burned the Capitol, they burned several other government buildings. It was horrible. And so there's plenty about the War of 1812 not to like. The Mexican-American War of the 1840s, this was one that was widely criticized at the time as a cynically aggressive move by President James Polk to take California and New Mexico and grab them away from Mexico. The United States had already, in effect, grabbed Texas. More precisely, Texas had rebelled against Mexico, declared its independence, and then the United States had annexed Texas. So Polk, not satisfied with Texas, wanted to go all the way to the Pacific coast, wanted to go all the way through New Mexico to California. And he offered to buy them from California, but California said, no, we're not selling. And so Polk cooked up a war, and he sent some American troops down to a disputed stretch of the border between the United States and Mexico, and basically said, get attacked, and it would be great if some of the soldiers would be wounded. If someone would get killed, that's part of the game. He didn't actually say this exactly, but everybody knew that was the whole idea. The troops were led by Zachary Taylor, and he was supposed to march up and down along the border and lure the Mexicans into defending what they considered to be part of Mexican territory. And they did. Americans were killed. Polk said, American blood has been shed on American soil. But even that didn't satisfy the opponents of the war. Abraham Lincoln thought the war was a terrible idea. And he thought it was something that was just cooked up in James Polk's head. Even Ulysses Grant, who had become the great hero of the Civil War, he thought that the war with Mexico was immoral, unethical. It was simply wrong. He said there was almost never been a more unjust war by a great power against its neighbor. And he served in the war. He was, as a soldier, he took his orders and all this, but he thought it was a bad war. The Civil War is one that obviously split the country. So nobody looks at the Civil War as a good war. The Civil War was something that was argued about while the war was on. It was argued about what the war was actually about, what it's for, what the outcome should be. It was argued over for a century. In some quarters, it's still argued over today. Was it a war primarily about slavery? Was it a war about states' rights? What do you even call the Civil War? In the North, it was generally called the Civil War, although Lincoln himself preferred either the War of the Rebellion or the insurrection, because he didn't want to acknowledge it as a real war. That would be tantamount to saying that, that Confederate States of America, that's a real country, because to have real wars, you have to have real countries fighting. Southerners typically called it the war between the states, because then we're just like those other states. We just have these different opinions and emphasize states' rights. That was their preferred view. Or sometimes they called it the War of Northern Aggression. We were just trying to defend ourselves against these northern attacks. And the fact that nearly all the fighting took place on southern soil, gave some credence to that. So the Civil War is nobody's idea of a good war. The Spanish-American War of 1898, well, this was one, again, widely criticized because it led to America's misadventure, many thought, in imperialism. It was one thing to go to war to free Cuba from Spanish oppression. All right, fair enough, but no sooner, in fact, even sooner than American troops got to Cuba, they got to the Philippines, and they seized the Philippines. And the United States came out of this war not simply as a defender of Cuban freedom and independence, but as an imperial overlord looking a lot like the British and the French and the other imperialists that Americans had long criticized. So the Spanish-American War was one that it was easy not to like. World War I, now this is the first time that the United States goes on to the world stage militarily. And at first Americans, the war broke out in 1914, and Americans kept their distance for a while because President Woodrow Wilson said, this is not our fight. We need to maintain our neutrality. And in fact, he urged Americans to be neutral in thought as well as in deed. It's one thing for the president to declare neutrality, saying we're not going to join the war. It's something else to tell Americans not to root for one side or the other. But that's what he did. He feared that Americans would get attached to one side or the other. In fact, many of them already were attached to one side or the other because many of them had come from the countries at war. This was a high tide of American immigration. So something like 25% to a third of the American population was either born in a foreign country or had parents who were born in a foreign country. So it was really easy when most of Europe was at war for Americans to take sides. Now, interesting, I suppose most people would root for the country of their origin, but not everybody. And so, for example, Jews who had been oppressed and beaten and killed in some cases in Russia, they fled Russia to the United States, and they weren't eager for Russia to win. Likewise, Irish. There were many Irish immigrants to the United States starting in the mid-19th century, and at that time, Ireland had effectively a colony of Britain. And the Irish didn't like the British at all. So the Irish were rooting against the country, or more precisely in this case, the empire of their origin. So Wilson's idea that Americans should make a point of not rooting for one side or the other quickly foundered on the fact that, yeah, they were rooting for one side or the other. Eventually, Americans got drawn in for a variety of other reasons as well. And America sent troops over there, and within short order, the American troops essentially tipped the balance in the war, and the American side won. Wilson went to the peace conference, and he came up with this great idea for preventing future wars. The only thing is that he went a lot farther than the American public was willing to support at the time. And so a bad taste in the mouth regarding World War I followed very quickly, very soon after the war ended, when the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended the war. And Americans quickly decided, you know what, that was a bad idea. And they thought that even more during the subsequent 2 decades, as Europe seemed to be repeating the same mistakes that had led it to war in 1914. And so during the 1920s and 1930s, the United States embraced isolationism, which was a way of saying, boy, we were sure foolish to go to war in World War I, and we're not going to repeat that mistake again. So that's the historic background as Americans enter World War II. Now, World War II lacked a lot of the things that made previous wars so divisive and that made them so easy to criticize. And it had some other things that kind of looked like a good deal. So, first of all, the way the United States got into World War II. Franklin Roosevelt, president since 1933, had seen the troubles mounting in Europe, had seen the troubles mounting in Asia, and he suspected at first, and then he became convinced that the United States was going to be dragged into the war. Either the war in the Pacific or the war in Europe, or quite possibly both. But he wanted to make sure that he didn't lead Americans into the war prematurely, because if he did, then there might be the kind of backlash that he had observed after World War I. So Roosevelt dragged his feet. He quietly sent aid to the opponents of the fascist powers, especially Hitler's Germany and militaristic Japan, but throw in Mussolini's Italy. Those were the Axis powers, the fascist powers, and those are the ones that the United States wanted to make sure lost the war. So Roosevelt quietly aided the British and the French, but he kept his distance until Japan struck out at the United States, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They did so because Roosevelt had fairly quietly declared what amounted to economic war against Japan, and was squeezing Japan economically, so that the Japanese thought that, well, they were already engaged in a war with the United States anyway, so they might as well make it a real war. So Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and killed over 2,000 people. But that very fact meant that the American people immediately fell into line against Japan. The United States had been attacked. American soil, clearly American soil. Hawaii was not yet a state, but it was a territory of the United States, and these were Americans who got killed. So Americans immediately said, this is our war. We have been attacked. There's nothing for ginning up enthusiasm for war like getting attacked, for having some of your compatriots killed. It sounds like a ghoulish, a cynical thing to say, but it's true. When Americans get killed, this is true of other countries as well, when citizens of that country get killed, then the country is at war. You don't have a choice. You don't debate it anymore. And, in fact, Congress almost unanimously and almost immediately declared war against Japan, which prompted Germany, for its own reasons, to declare war against the United States. Germany had an alliance with Japan. And so the United States found itself at war with Japan, at war with Germany, or Italy too, but Italy was by clearly the least problematic of the three. But anyway, so on the category of what makes a war good or what makes a war acceptable, the fact that the United States had been attacked, and then the United States had had war declared upon it, Well, you couldn't fault the Roosevelt administration, you couldn't fault the American government for responding. You have to go to war. So there was no debate, really, about whether the United States should be in the war at all. So that's important. Secondly, the enemy, the United States enemy in World War II, was a great enemy, especially Hitler, because Hitler was this tyrant, this person who was beating up on Europeans, and who, as became apparent during the course of the war, and especially after the war, had a horrendously murderous program toward the Jews of Europe, killing 6 million in the Holocaust. And so, if you're going to go to war, in order to maintain the enthusiasm for war, it helps a lot to have a really evil villain on the other side. And Hitler couldn't have been a better villain. I mean, he's a horrible guy, but that's what makes him a great villain, an ideal villain for the United States. So when America went to war, it could go to war saying, first of all, we were attacked. Secondly, the people on the other side are really bad. And when you get in the category of the good war, it's nice to believe that your side is on the side of good, and the other guys are on the other side of evil. And you couldn't get more evil than Hitler. Well, except maybe. Now, this is where I have to sort of bring in an exception. And it's important to know that Americans kind of ignored this. America's allies in the war, America's principal ally in the war was Britain. And Britain was a democracy, like the United States. So Franklin Roosevelt could say that this was a war for democracy. And the governments of Japan, the governments of Germany, the governments of Italy, these were not democracies. So it's democracy against fascism, a form of oppression. Except that the third ally on the Grand Alliance, the American side, was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wasn't a democracy. The Soviet Union was a socialist dictatorship, a communist dictatorship. So Roosevelt and American supporters of the war kind of had to work their way around that one. And what they said was basically, look, in wartime, when you're fighting for your life, you don't always get to choose the ideal allies. So Americans sort of looked past the evil side of Joseph Stalin. And when I said Hitler was the ideal, the greatest, the worst, the most evil guy of the 20th century, there is, again, this sort of ghoulish, I won't call it a competition, but if you're rating the tyrants of the 20th century who've killed the most people, it's kind of a close call between whether it's Hitler, Stalin, or maybe Mao Zedong of China. Oh, wait a minute. The United States also had an ally of China, except Mao wasn't the government in China at that point. So you don't have to worry about that. So to reiterate, the war started in a way that Americans couldn't resist. Okay, the U.S. had been attacked, so that's one element of a good war. Secondly, the people on the other side were really bad guys. And I say, when the full evil of the Holocaust became clear at the end of the war, then it confirmed that the United States had been fighting on the side of good. A third element that really makes for a good war is that World War II, all things considered, was remarkably short. The United States got in effectively at the beginning of 1942, and the war ended in the middle of 1945. So we're talking about 3.5 years of war. And that's pretty good for the United States waging the biggest war in history, participating in the biggest war in history, and defeating the other side. Oh, that's that's another element in what makes a war a good war. It was an overwhelming victory for the American side. This because America's policy in World War II was unconditional surrender. We're going to beat those other guys to a pulp. And there's not going to be any doubt at the end of the war who won. Now, in fact, at the end of the war against Japan, the United States backed off this a little bit when American leaders decided that it would probably be handy to leave the Emperor of Japan on his throne, because it would help American occupation forces govern Japan. Americans were willing to occupy Germany and figure out how to run Germany. But it might be a little bit harder to run Japan without sort of local help. And so It wasn't exactly unconditional surrender in the war against Japan, but it was very clear who won. In fact, this was dramatically shown when Douglas MacArthur, the American general, went to Tokyo to accept the surrender of the Japanese. And he was warned by his advisors, boy, you better go in with a full military escort, because there are bound to be some bitter enders there in Japan who will probably try to kill you, assassinate you. And MacArthur said, nope, I'm going to go in alone. I mean, he went with a small detail, but nothing like the military escort that he was advised to take. And he said, when I do this, it will make very clear to the Japanese that they have lost. And it had an enormous psychological effect on the Japanese. So, I guess we're on number 4. The fourth thing that made World War II the good war, was that it won with a clear and overwhelming American victory. There was no question that the American side won this war. And it always makes for a better war if your side wins, very clearly. Another element, maybe a last element, maybe I'll leave it at that, is that World War II had an enormously positive effect on the American economy. And Americans who were of any age to fight in the war, Americans who were of age to sort of observe and participate in the public affairs of the war, they remembered the decade-long depression that preceded the war. And they remembered the Depression as a time of want, where they didn't have jobs, many of them didn't have homes, a time when people had to really scrimp and save to hold their lives together, and where, because of the Depression and all of the difficulties it created, there were bitter politics in the United States, and the Republicans were complaining against the Democrats and vice versa. So the Great Depression, the decade of the Great Depression, had been one of the worst decades in American history. The country was torn apart by the Depression, by the politics of the Depression. And then comes the war. And immediately, the war pulls everybody together, because during war, you have to pull together. Have to unify for the war effort. And it had the marvelously positive effect of yanking the United States out of the Depression. The United States did not come out of the Depression as a result of the New Deal policies of Franklin Roosevelt. It came out of the Depression because of for those days, enormous government spending for military preparation, and then the fighting of the war itself. And the government just pumped money into the economy, because during wartime, this is what governments do. You buy everything you need and then a bunch of stuff you might only possibly need, so that you'll be prepared, so that you can win the war. And so Americans remembered that the war unified them and then made them prosperous again. And so as a result of all of this, Americans at the end of the war think, boy, this war, this was a great thing. And it's certainly hard not to agree with them, except it does make you got to overlook a few things. It was a horrible war. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died. As I said, millions of people in other countries died. The United States was involved in some really nasty fighting, and American tactics, for the most part, were above board and according to the rules of warfare, but not entirely, and especially in the realm of strategic bombing. No one had ever realized before the war how effective, or I should say, how devastating bombing raids on cities could be. Whether they were actually militarily effective remained a separate question. But no one had really contemplated using bombers to obliterate cities. And German cities were obliterated during the war, but especially Japanese cities. And so Tokyo was firebombed. Japanese cities, including Tokyo, were made in large part of paper and other wood products. And once set afire, then the fires just raged like crazy. And so Tokyo was firebombed. And then at the end of the war, Harry Truman, the American president then, who succeeded Roosevelt upon Roosevelt's death, ordered the dropping of 2 atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And 150,000 people died, mostly civilians. So there were some bad parts of this good war. But nonetheless, Americans at the time thought that as wars went, it's kind of hard to beat World War II. Now, as we'll see, World War II improves in American memory when measured against the wars that would follow. But even in its own time, World War II was about as good a war as Americans could hope to get in the 20th century.